Welcome back, everyone, to Saving America's Pets. I'm Holly Sizemore, Chief Mission Officer with Best Friends, and this is Rose, my cuddly co-host, who is reminding everyone to please hit like and that subscribe button. Imagine you work for an animal shelter with a life-saving rate above 90%. And if you work in a shelter, hopefully you do. But have you ever wondered about the different reality other shelters experience? Different shelters and organizations, even within the same county, have very different mandates and very different hurdles and challenges. And no matter where you may be in your shelter's life-saving journey, we can learn a lot from walking a mile in one another's shoes and really listening and learning about others' experiences. Today, we will talk to Marc Peralta, Chief Program Officer for Best Friends, about the state of America's shelters and the varied problems being tackled these days as hopefully the pandemic eases. Hi, Marc. It's so nice to have you here.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
I know you and your team are out in the country all the time, working side by side with our wonderful shelter partners. Tell me, what are you and your team seeing right now in terms of the state of our nation's shelters?
I think in animal welfare, if you work in this industry, you know that it's tough a lot. And I think this time is no different from that, except that there's a couple other of small things that I think just make it a little bit different. There's a lot of insecurity around getting enough staff members to kind of keep the day-to-day operations kind of whole. That make it a little bit different. Like there's always tough stuff, but you know, the great resignation is definitely affecting our partners across the country. I still think effects of COVID and, you know, people staying healthy and being able to have like full teams. Those are probably the two most prominent things that are making it a really difficult time right now in animal welfare for some of our partners around the country.
So what advice would you give a shelter leader or manager right now who is feeling overwhelmed?
Again, I think we feel overwhelmed a lot in this industry. And I think every time that happens, and it's going to happen no matter what the situation is, take a step back and breathe. You're going to get through this. We know what to do. We just need to recalibrate, use data, and do what we know. So for instance, if we're having issues with our staffing, we need to work around kind of how and when we're working and how we're bringing in animals. We may have to limit our ability to take in animals at certain times to be able to meet the needs of our staffing areas. I think the biggest thing as well is to you know, lately, I think we've really relied on what we've done post-pandemic in regards to things like outcomes, you know, doing, I think, appointment only adoptions and those kind of things were understandable. But if we're continuing to do appointment only adoptions, putting in barriers for people just to be able to come when we're open and meet animals, those are the things that have made us really successful in the past of getting animals out of our shelters quickly. I think being able to do events again when we're feeling safer, when we have the staff to do it, those are the kind of things that were pinnacle for us to get us to where we were before the pandemic that I think we need to revisit and make sure that we're thinking about. Because again, we know what we need to do. It's just really kind of taking a step back, knowing it's going to be okay, and then doing what you know what to do to meet the needs that you have or some of the obstacles that you're facing in your shelter on a day-to-day basis.
So what are some tips and tricks for shelter staff and leaders to kind of figure out on that day-to-day basis if they need to pivot?
We talk a lot, Best Friends, and I think it can't go without saying you need to pay attention to your stats. You need to pay attention to what's going on in your shelter. So it doesn't mean that you need to be a statistician. Sometimes it's a matter of how many animals have we brought in this week and how many animals have we gotten out. I think that little things like that. And if you're seeing that they're starting to become a bubble, you know, because even if you have a lot of animals in foster, they're still awaiting potential placement ultimately into a permanent home. So those can kind of add up and those animals are still in your area. So I think first and foremost, pay attention to your basic statistics. How are you doing with bringing animals in versus getting animals out alive?
Marc, I've heard you talk a lot about the need for high-performing shelters to walk a mile in the shoes of some shelters who day-to-day grapple with a lack of resources. Why do you think that is so important?
I think we thinks too much in two dimensionals when we're talking about theory. So if a shelter is struggling or they don't have resources, they're bad. And if a shelter has resources and they're not struggling, they're good. But in the real world, that makes no sense. Most innovation comes from shelters that are struggling. They don't have resources. They're trying to find ways to figure things out. So one, I think you're going to find a lot of innovation when you go into places that maybe still are struggling to save lives, but are probably doing amazing things that you wouldn't know, because they have to figure things out on the fly because they don't have as much money or the amount of resources that another shelter has. But I think secondly, we're all in this together. Animal welfare is a movement. And I think, what's true in one shelter versus another, like we have to get out of our own specific jurisdictions at times. And when we can, support each other, because our colleagues are going through the same thing. We all love animals. We want to help animals. And there's ways that if we're just more aware of kind of what's happening with shelters, and sometimes it's not things like, you know, the north to the south. Sometimes it's a county away, that people just aren't aware that shelters are struggling. And it's just not in the DNA of many shelters to kind of be aware, even some that are in proximity, of what's going on. And I think it's eye-opening on how, if you're combining and doing partnerships, what you can kind of do for animals and for people that love animals in your community by effectively being aware and going into situations where people are really struggling, because you're going to learn something and you're going to have some really big benefit of potentially helping a shelter that really needs your help.
How do shelters who have more resources, they're living and working in communities that animals aren't at risk like they are in some other areas, how do you keep things urgent if you're working in that kind of environment?
To me, in my experience, urgency really comes with, goals. And measurement. If I'm not measuring things, or if I don't have goals, it's very easy for me to get into a very status quo. And I see that a lot with businesses, or even with organizations that I've worked with or partnered with in the past. So for me, I think it's really important, if you're in an agency that is lucky enough to have a lot of resources, that doesn't really have a sheltering population problem or volume problem on a day-to-day basis, I can assure you that there's shelters that are probably in pretty close proximity to you that are not feeling the same way. And again, this is about communities. Like, animal welfare is a system. So it's fantastic. And maybe you can take what you've been able to learn and what you've been able to do to ultimately get your community to that place, to help a neighboring community or a different shelter, because those animals need your help. Those fellow shelter workers need your help. Honestly, I guarantee you're going to learn things as well, because there are things that they're forced to come up with that are out of the box because of the situations that they're in, that sometimes for those of us that are, sitting in more resource shelters, don't really have that push to innovate in the same way. So it's a win-win operation. And not to mention, your community, digs. It's easy to fundraise when you're helping outside communities and those kind of things, because you're saving lives, you're helping animals, you're measuring things. Those are things that are really key to fundraising and strong fundraising operations.
Are government shelters able to do this as well?
I think it's a little bit more complex with government shelters, but yes, I think you're starting to see more and more there is buy-in from cities that like to have that mentoring reputation, being that, life-saving community that's going and helping other places. I think you have to get creative, like any shelter. Sometimes you fundraise through a friends of versus the municipality to be able to do some of this stuff. But it's not just for the privates. You're seeing more and more of these muni shelters. And again, it's about, hey, I live in, this community, this big city, and we're a municipal shelter, but we're helping all of these other communities. And what does that do as a reflection of your own community and how you're helping others, and animals there too? So you're seeing that more and more. So it's not just for the privates.
There are so many great things Mark and I have discussed that we will pick up this conversation in the next episode of Saving America's Pets, where we also talk about our recently launched Kitten Season campaign.